receipt from the summer bulb competition tea, £2.3, and there he stopped. It was not the dramatic kind of stop that causes ladies to put down cups and men to clear throats. It was smaller than that, more like a hesitation in a clock. Yet, in a place such as Flaxborough, where novelty had to make do with the materials at hand, it was enough. Mr. Wopshaw blinked once, turned the page over as if numbers might be on the reverse, and then looked with faint distress at the lined faces before him. Mrs. Bessamy, who arranged flowers with a moral severity absent from her marriage, was first to speak. "Is something missing, Mr. Wopshaw?" He gave a little cough. "Not missing, precisely." This distinction interested the room at once. At the far end, Councillor Sidney Roke, who attended every local committee on the principle that it was dangerous to leave anything to amateurs, leaned back and folded his arms. His moustache gave him the appearance of being permanently unconvinced. "Well, if it isn't missing," he said, "perhaps it has merely gone for a walk." There was a dutiful ripple of laughter. Mr. Wopshaw, to whom it came as an added burden, did not receive it. "I seem," he said, "to have a discrepancy of £7, 4 shillings and 6pence. Now the room is properly stirred." Several members turned instinctively towards one another with the alertness of hens hearing fresh grain. £7, 4 and 6 was not a sum that would shake the Bank of England, but it was ample for a market town society whose proudest recent purchase had been a new set of folding chairs. The importance of money in such circles did not depend on the amount. It depended on whose hands had touched it. Mrs. Dalrymple, secretary, and a woman whose spectacles seemed to accuse people before she had spoken, said, "You checked the receipts?" "Twice, and the petty cash tin 3 times. Then," said Councillor Roke, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who disliked ambiguity, "someone has been helping himself." "No, no," murmured Mr. Wopshaw quickly. "I wouldn't wish to put it so strongly. Nobody in Flaxborough ever wished to put anything strongly. It was one of the town's chief methods of doing so." Mrs. Croot, who had charge of the teas and therefore knew more than anyone about both milk and character, leaned towards Mrs. Bessamy and whispered with sufficient volume to be useful. "It'll be that young fellow's. He handled the gate money at the Rose Show and wore suede shoes. I noticed them. Young Peter Fellows, who was 26 and possessed the vague hair and optimistic neckties of youth, coloured from collar to brow. 'I beg your pardon,' he said. 'I entered the gate money exactly as I received it. Then perhaps people paid in counterfeit sixpences,' said Councillor Roke. This was the sort of remark that passed in Flaxborough for practical administration. The chairman, Dr. Wayne, who had been elected largely because he was accustomed to saying, "Let us proceed," now said it again. But the meeting had already ceased to be about begonias, and everyone knew it. The accounts were passed round, necks extended, spectacles were adjusted. One could almost hear respectability rehearsing its outraged face. It was at this point that Sergeant Love, who had come only to collect a subscription list for the Police Orphan Fund from the room next door, appeared at the open door and was persuaded in. Flaxborough had a genius for converting passers-by into witnesses. Love listened with his usual amiable gravity, examined the papers without conviction, and suggested that if the society wished, the matter could be mentioned to Inspector Purbright. There was a brief silence after that name, not from fear, but from a collective sense that matters had thereby become real. Purbright was not theatrical enough to be exciting, which in local detection amounted to a kind of prestige. He had a habit of looking as though people were telling him more than they intended, and of thanking them for it. Mr. Wopshaw dabbed at his forehead. "It may turn out to be my own error, of course." "Let us hope so," said Mrs. Dalrymple, in a tone that implied the hope would not survive inspection. By the time the meeting broke up, the discrepancy had passed through the room in several forms: missing money, muddled money, borrowed money, suspicious money, and, from one enterprising soul near the coat stand, embezzlement. Outside in the mild evening, bicycles were wheeled away, collars turned up, and small confidential knots formed beneath the yellow light of the parish lamp. Before the first hour was out, half Flaxborough knew that the Horticultural Society accounts were wrong. Before the second, nearly everyone knew who was probably to blame. Only Inspector Purbright, seated at his desk with a cup of tea, going slowly grey, beside a stack of reports, did not yet know anything at all. By the following morning, the matter had acquired that faint but persistent hum which indicated it had settled comfortably into the town's conversational bloodstream. It moved through bakeries and behind counters, along queue edges and between folded newspapers, acquiring detail not so much through evidence as through repetition. By 11 o'clock, Mr. Wopshaw's £7, 4 and 6, had been observed in at least 3 different purses and, in one version, seen folded discreetly into a gentleman's inside pocket. Inspector Purbright became aware of it not through an official report, but by way of Mrs. Hatch at the stationer's, who had never in her life conveyed information directly when it might be offered as a remark about envelopes. "Short of cash they are," she said, aligning a row of ink bottles with more care than was strictly necessary, though of course one does hear things. Societies are always the same. One person counting, another person not looking. Purbright, who had come in search of a fresh supply of blotting paper, inclined his head slightly. "Which society is that, Mrs. Hatch?" "The horticultural people," she said. "Begonias and so forth, though I dare say it's not the flowers themselves. It's the sort of thing that gathers around them." This, to Purbright's mind, was often the case. By the time he returned to the station, Sergeant Love had already left a note on his desk, written in a hand that took pains to be legible without quite succeeding. It contained the essentials: a discrepancy in the accounts of the Flaxborough Amateur Horticultural and Improvement Society. Treasurer 1, Edwin Wopshaw. Sum missing £7, 4 shillings and 6pence. Matter presently informal, but likely to become less so. Purbright read it once, then again, and placed it carefully beside his cup. There was nothing in the amount to trouble him. It was, as he would later remark, exactly the kind of figure that encouraged people to behave out of proportion to it. Large sums brought clarity, small ones invited characters. He sent a brief message asking Mr. Wopshaw if he might call, received a reply within the hour, neatly written, apologetic, and expressing a hope that the inspector would not consider the matter too trifling for his attention. Purbright never considered trifles trifling until they had proved themselves so, which they seldom did. Mr. Wopshaw received him in a sitting-room that seemed arranged chiefly to avoid offence. The furniture was polite, the ornaments cautious, and the clock on the mantel ticked with a conscientiousness that suggested it had been praised for it. The treasurer himself appeared to have slept poorly, and to regret it. "I'm most obliged," he said, offering a chair, as though it might be refused. "It is, I'm sure, nothing very much. Only I felt, well, one must be exact, mustn't one?" "One must be consistent," said Purbright. Exactness follows. He accepted the account-book, which had been placed ready on a side table, and opened it without hurry. The entries were careful, the figures small and regular, the ink of a single shade except where corrections had been made with a lighter hand. Purbright turned the pages as if listening to them. "You have kept these yourself throughout?" "Oh, yes, always. It is not a difficult task, only a matter of putting things where they belong." "And the sum in question, when did you first notice it?" "Last evening, just as I was reading it out. I had balanced it the previous afternoon, you see, but I did not do well. I did not read it aloud until the meeting. and then it would not agree. Purbright nodded slightly. Did you add anything after balancing? No, that is only the petty cash from the bulb competition tea, but that was already accounted for. I checked it twice, he said twice with a quiet dignity, as though the number carried weight. Purbright's finger rested briefly on a column of figures. You have here a receipt for gate money at the Rose Show. Yes. Young fellows collected it. Very willing. He brought it round that evening in a paper bag. And you counted it then? I did. It was correct. Purbright closed the book for a moment, not to end the inspection, but to consider it from another angle. Has anyone else had access to the accounts? Mr. Wopshaw hesitated, though not in a manner that suggested concealment. Rather, he appeared to be choosing the least inconvenient truth. Well, Mrs. Dalrymple, naturally. As secretary, she sometimes checks figures against notices for the parish magazine, and Councillor Roke has, on occasion, asked to see them, only in a general way. In a general way, repeated Purbright, as if testing the phrase for balance. And of course, Mr. Wopshaw added, the petty cash tin is kept in the vestry cupboard, though it is always locked. I have the key, always. There was the smallest pause. Yes, that is almost always. It is sometimes left on the hook behind the cupboard door during meetings. For convenience? Convenience in Flaxborough had a habit of enlarging small matters. Purbright reopened the book and turned again to the page with the Rose Show entries. His eye moved not over the totals, but over the manner in which they had been written, the slight tightening of the script, the careful placing of a figure where another had first been attempted and then altered. It was not, in itself, remarkable, but it was not without interest. Outside, somewhere in the street, a bicycle bell rang twice in quick succession and was gone. Purbright closed the account book gently and set it down. I think, he said, I should like to speak with Mr. Fellows, and with Mrs. Dalrymple, if it is convenient. Mr. Wopshaw nodded with relief that was almost gratitude. Of course. Anything that may clear the matter up. Yes, said Purbright mildly, that is generally the intention. As he took his leave, he glanced once more at the mantel clock. It ticked on, quite certain, of itself. On the doorstep, he paused for a moment, as though considering the weather, and then turned towards the High Street where, at that hour, one might expect to find both gossip and its source moving in opposite directions. The sum remained the same, but it had begun very quietly to shift its shape. The High Street, at that hour, was conducting its usual quiet commerce in both goods and opinions. Purbright moved along it without haste, pausing briefly at the greengrocer's window as though considering apples, though his attention was directed rather towards the reflections in the glass. Flaxborough, like most places of its size, had a way of revealing its business sideways. Young Peter Fellows was found not far beyond, outside the ironmonger's, engaged in the uncertain task of comparing two lengths of garden twine with an expression that suggested neither had quite justified its existence. He greeted the inspector with an eagerness that bordered on relief. Inspector. Good morning. I expect you've heard. I have heard something, said Purbright. I thought it might be useful to hear it from you. Fellows gave a short laugh, which immediately apologized for itself. It's all got rather out of hand, I'm afraid. I did nothing except collect the gate money. It was very straightforward. Straightforward things often are, said Purbright. How did you collect it? At the entrance to the Rose Show, table, cash box, tickets. People paid as they came in. Some exact, some not. I gave change where necessary, and at the end I counted it there and then. Mrs. Croot was still about, packing up cups. I remember because she said I'd short-changed her on a half-crown, which I hadn't. Then I put the money into a paper bag and took it round to Mr. Wopshaw that evening. At once? Yes. I didn't want it lying about. Purbright inclined his head. Quite so. Did anyone accompany you? No, I went alone. It's only a short walk. And the bag, did you seal it? Fellows hesitated. No, it was just folded over. I didn't think, well, there didn't seem any need. No, said Purbright mildly. There seldom does. Fellows shifted his weight, the twine forgotten in his hand. You don't think I think, said Purbright, that you have told me what you did. That is sufficient for the moment. The young man accepted this with visible effort, as though it were both less and more than he had hoped for. Purbright left him at the ironmonger's threshold and continued along the street, turning at last towards the narrow passage that led to the back of the parish rooms. Mrs. Dalrymple was there, as might have been predicted, arranging a small stack of parish magazines with the air of a general reviewing troops. She looked up as he approached, her expression already prepared. Inspector, I suppose it was inevitable. Inevitable things are often the most instructive, he said. I understand you have seen the accounts. I have done more than see them, she replied. I have compared them. It is quite clear that something has been altered. Altered? A figure here and there, not dramatically, but enough. One notices these things if one is accustomed to print. Numbers have a way of betraying themselves when they are not what they were meant to be. Purbright regarded her with polite interest. You believe the discrepancy arises from alteration rather than omission? I believe, she said, adjusting the topmost magazine so that it aligned precisely with the one beneath, that Mr. Wopshaw is a careful man, but not an imaginative one. If a mistake had been made, it would be obvious. This is not obvious, therefore it is something else. Something else, repeated Purbright. And I may say, she continued, lowering her voice in a manner that did not diminish its reach, that the society has grown rather lax of late. Too many people handling things. Councillor Roke, for instance, takes an interest that is not always helpful. And as for that young fellow, enthusiasm is not a substitute for reliability. Purbright did not immediately respond. Instead, he glanced towards the vestry door, which stood slightly ajar. Beyond it, the cupboard in question was visible, its small brass lock catching the light. The petty cash tin is kept there. Yes, Mr. Wopshaw's arrangement. And the key, on a hook behind the door, or in his pocket, or occasionally, I regret to say, left in the lock itself. Purbright stepped into the vestry and examined the cupboard without touching it. The key was indeed present, hanging where described. It had the look of an object that had been considered secure by agreement rather than by practice. Who attends the meetings regularly? He asked. Everyone who fought, said Mrs. Dalrymple, which in Flaxborough meant a great deal, and some who ought not. Councillor Roke, always. Mrs. Croot, for the teas, and yourself, of course. Of course. Purbright nodded, as though confirming a list that had already been made elsewhere. You mentioned alteration. Can you show me where you observed it? Mrs. Dalrymple produced the account book with a readiness that suggested it had not been far from her reach. She opened it to the page in question and indicated with a forefinger of some authority a column of figures. There, she said, and there. You see how the ink is slightly lighter, and the formation of the 4 is not consistent. Mr. Wopshaw makes his 4s closed. That one is open. Purbright looked closely. It was, as she said, a small thing, but small things had a way of attaching themselves to larger ones. Yes, he said, I see. Outside a cart passed, its wheels making a soft complaint against the cobbles. The sound lingered briefly, then moved on. Purbright closed the book once more. I think, he said, it would be useful to speak with Councillor Roke. Mrs. Dalrymple allowed herself the faintest inclination of satisfaction. I should not be surprised if you found that useful indeed. Purbright thanked her and stepped back into the passage. The air there was cooler, and for a moment he stood without moving, as though considering not the people involved, but the spaces between them. The figures, the key, the bag, the ink. None of them had changed, but they no longer sat quite as they had. Councillor Sidney Roke was discovered precisely where one might expect him to be at 12:30, in the public room of the King's Arms, occupying a chair that had long since accepted him as part of its arrangement. Before him stood a pint whose level suggested careful attention rather than enthusiasm, and beside it a folded newspaper marked at several points in pencil. He greeted Inspector Purbright with the restrained satisfaction of a man whose expectations of official involvement had been confirmed. "I thought it would come to this," he said, indicating the opposite chair with a gesture that managed to be both hospitable and proprietary. Matters of money always do. Purbright sat down and placed his hat neatly on the table. "So I understand." Roke took a measured sip before continuing, as though to ensure his remarks were properly supported. "I have always maintained that societies of this kind are well-meaning, though they lack the necessary discipline, too many hands, too much trust, and not enough supervision." "You have taken an interest in the accounts," said Purbright. "A general interest," Roke replied, with the same phrase that had already begun to circulate. "One does not need to examine every figure to perceive when things are not as they should be." "No," said Purbright. "One often perceives that earlier." Roke allowed himself a brief smile, which did not extend far beyond the moustache. "Quite so. And I may say, Inspector, that I was not entirely surprised by this discrepancy. You had anticipated it? I had anticipated that something of the kind might occur. There has been a certain looseness of late, that young Fellows, for instance, was very eager, but without the steadiness required. And Wopshaw, though conscientious, is perhaps too inclined to assume that others are the same." Purbright regarded him with mild attention. "Have you seen the accounts yourself?" "On occasion. As I say, in a general way. And on those occasions did you observe anything irregular?" Roke hesitated, though not in the manner of a man searching his memory. "It was closer to a selection." "Nothing that one could point to directly," he said at last. "Only a sense and impression that matters were not entirely in hand." Purbright nodded as though this were a measurable quantity. Impressions can be useful provided one knows where they begin. Roke leaned back slightly, the chair acknowledging the movement with a soft complaint. "I take it you have spoken to the others, to some of them." "And what is your view?" "I do not yet have one," said Purbright. "I am still collecting them." Roke gave a short, approving grunt. "Quite right, though I should not be surprised if you find the explanation a simple one." "These things usually are." "Simple," repeated Purbright. "Yes. A young man with access to cash, a lack of proper oversight, is hardly novel." "No," said Purbright, "it is not." There was a brief pause, during which the sounds of the room arranged themselves, the low murmur of conversation from the far table, the faint clink of glass, the distant closing of a door. Roke's fingers tapped once against the newspaper, then were still. "You will, of course, wish to examine the vestry cupboard," he said. "The key arrangement is most unsatisfactory. I have said as much on more than one occasion. So I have heard, and the petty cash tin left accessible during meetings. It invites mischief." "Mischief," said Purbright, as if considering its range. Roke leaned forward slightly. "Inspector, if I may speak plainly, this town depends on people knowing their place. Once that begins to slip, small irregularities become larger ones. It is not merely a question of £7. Purbright inclined his head. "No, it seldom is." Roke seemed satisfied with this and returned his attention to the pint, as though the matter had been adequately framed. After a moment, Purbright said, "You were present at the Rose Show, of course. I am present at all such events. And at the close of the gate, I remained until the end, yes." "Did you observe Mr. Fellows counting the money?" "I observed him at the table. Whether he was counting at that precise moment I could not say. There was a good deal of movement. And afterwards?" "I left shortly thereafter. I had other engagements." Purbright did not pursue this immediately. Instead, he allowed his gaze to rest briefly on the folded newspaper, noting the pencil marks beside certain columns, the careful underlining of figures that had no direct bearing on the matter at hand. "Do you take an interest in accounts generally?" he asked. Roke followed his glance and placed a hand over the paper with a faint, defensive neatness. One likes to be informed. "Quite so." Purbright rose then, taking up his hat. "Thank you, Councillor. Your impressions have been most helpful." Roke inclined his head, accepting the word without question. As Purbright stepped out into the street, the midday light had settled into a steady, unremarkable brightness. A delivery van passed, its driver raising a hand in acknowledgment. Somewhere further along, a voice called out a greeting that was not intended for him but included him nonetheless. He paused for a moment at the edge of the pavement, not to consider where to go next, but to allow the pieces already gathered to settle. The young man with the bag, the careful treasurer, the precise secretary, the councillor with his impressions. And among them the small alteration of a figure open where it should have been closed. It was as yet only a detail. But it had begun quite distinctly to choose its company. It was still that same midday brightness when Purbright turned back towards the parish rooms, though by now the street had thinned slightly, as if conversation itself had withdrawn indoors to examine what it had just said. The vestry door stood open as before, and the quiet inside had the faint, settled quality of a place that had already been discussed more than it had been used. He entered without sound and went directly to the cupboard. The key hung precisely where Mrs. Dalrymple had indicated, resting against the wood in a manner that suggested habit rather than caution. Purbright lifted it, not to remove it, but merely to feel its weight. It was a small, ordinary key, worn slightly smooth at the edges. He opened the cupboard and withdrew the petty cash tin. It too was ordinary, a dull metal box with a clasp that closed more from agreement than resistance. Inside were coins, notes folded with varying degrees of intention, and a small paper slip upon which a previous total had been written and crossed through. Nothing in. It appeared disturbed, yet Purbright did not replace the tin immediately. Instead, he held it for a moment longer than was necessary, as though considering not its contents but its circumstances. The cupboard, the key, the meetings, the passing hands, none of it was secure in the strict sense. It depended rather upon a collective understanding that no one would trouble it. He set the tin back and closed the cupboard, leaving the key in place. On the small table nearby lay a stack of parish magazines, and beside them, somewhat apart, a loose sheet of paper bearing a list of subscriptions, names, amounts, ticks in the margin. Purbright glanced over it without interest until his eye paused, almost idly, on a figure that had been written and then altered. It was a small correction. A 3 turned into an 8, or perhaps the reverse. The ink was lighter, the pressure slightly different. He picked up the paper and held it nearer the light. The alteration was not clumsy. It had been made with care, as though the writer had wished it to pass without remark. And indeed it would have done so had there not already been cause to look. Purbright replaced the sheet exactly as he had found it and stepped back into the passage. Outside, the afternoon had begun its gradual incline towards quiet. A bicycle passed again, slower this time, its rider glancing briefly towards the vestry door before continuing. The town, it seemed, was not yet finished with the matter. From the direction of the High Street came the sound of voices, and presently Mrs. Croot appeared, carrying a covered tray, with the purposeful caution of someone transporting both china and opinion. She stopped upon seeing Purbright, her expression shifting at once from occupation to opportunity. "Inspector," she said, "I was just thinking of you." "Or rather, of the business. That is often the order of things," he replied. She adjusted the tray slightly. "It's a nasty business, if you ask me. Money going astray like that. Not what one expects from a society." "No," said Purbright. "What does one expect?" "Decency," she said promptly, "and proper behaviour, which is more than can be said for some." She did not name them, which in Flaxborough was a method of doing so. "You were present at the Rose Show," Purbright said. "I was present throughout. Teas don't serve themselves, and you saw Mr. Fellows collecting the gate money." "I saw him sitting there, yes, looking pleased with himself, as young men do when they have a box in front of them. Though I will say this, he counted it carefully enough. I watched him more than once, and afterwards he took it away, said he was going straight to Mr. Wopshaw. I told him not to loiter, did he?" She gave a small, considering frown. "He went out by the side gate. Whether he loitered beyond that I couldn't say. I had cups to attend to." Purbright nodded. "And the others? Councillor Roke, for instance?" Mrs. Croot's lips pressed together briefly as though to prevent something from escaping too readily. "He was about, in and out, keeping an eye, as he calls it. Though I've always thought he keeps an eye on things best left alone." "In what way?" "Oh, just looking where others might not, asking questions that don't quite belong." He had the accounts in his hand at one point, I noticed, turning the pages as if they were his own. Purbright regarded her steadily. "When was that?" "During the tea, I believe." Mr. Wopshaw had left them on the table. "Only for a moment, no doubt. But a moment is enough, if one is inclined." She shifted the tray again, as though the memory had added weight to it. "And you are inclined to think?" "I am inclined to think," she said, lowering her voice slightly, "that people who take too much interest in other people's figures sometimes have reasons of their own." There was a pause, not uncomfortable, but complete. Purbright thanked her and stepped aside to let her pass. She moved on towards the vestry with the same careful purpose, leaving behind a faint trace of tea and conclusion. He remained where he was for a moment, his gaze resting not on any particular object, but on the arrangement of them all: the cupboard, the table, the path by the side gate, a bag carried alone, a book left unattended, a key that was always somewhere, and a figure altered just enough to pass. It was still, in every outward respect, a small matter, but it had begun to gather almost imperceptibly a second shape beneath the first. Purbright did not immediately leave the vestry passage. Instead, he turned once more, not towards the cupboard this time, but towards the small side door that led out by the gate Mrs. Croot had mentioned. It opened easily, as though accustomed to brief and unobserved departures, and beyond it ran a narrow path, bordered by a hedge that had grown with more enthusiasm than design. He stepped out and paused, allowing his eyes to adjust not to the light, which had scarcely changed, but to the sense of direction the path implied. It led away from the main entrance and the polite visibility of the High Street, curving instead towards the back of the neighbouring properties, where movement could pass without comment, simply because it was not expected. The ground bore no marks that could be called useful. Flaxborough did not often provide such conveniences, but the arrangement itself, the existence of a way that was neither concealed nor acknowledged, was enough to suggest its own kind of opportunity. He returned to the front by way of the street, not retracing his steps but completing them, and found Sergeant Love waiting by the station door with the patient air of a man who had been thinking in a straight line for some time. "I've had a word or two," Love said, falling into step beside him. "Nothing definite, only that it's the sort of thing that makes people uneasy." "Yes," said Purbright, "it would." "They're settling on the young fellow," Love continued. "Fellows, it seems to fit." "Does it? Well, he had the money, carried it about. No one else seems to have done so." Purbright did not answer at once. They entered the station together, and he removed his hat with the same care he had shown in replacing it earlier. "Convenience," he said at last, "is often mistaken for explanation." Love considered this, as he always did, with a seriousness that did not hurry itself. "You think there's more to it?" "I think," said Purbright, "that there is less to it than appears, and that the less is not yet properly arranged." He sat down at his desk and drew the account book towards him again, though he did not open it immediately. Instead, he reached for a blank sheet of paper and wrote a single figure upon it, 746. He looked at it for a moment, then added, beneath it, in a smaller hand, several other figures taken from memory gate receipts, tea money, subscriptions. Not to total them, but to place them in relation. Love watched this process with quiet attention. "It's a small sum," he said. "Yes," said Purbright, "small enough to be moved without effort, large enough to be noticed once it has." He opened the account book and turned again to the altered figures, the open 4, the lighter ink, the careful correction. It was not the work of a careless hand. It suggested, rather, a person who believed themselves capable of precision. "Tell me," he said, without looking up, "when you saw the accounts at the meeting, were they passed round?" "They were," said Love. "Everyone had a look, more or less, some longer than others." "And Councillor Roke?" Love gave a slight nod. "He had them for a bit. Looked through them as if he expected to find something." "As if he expected to find something," repeated Purbright softly. He closed the book again and placed it beside the paper on which the figures had been written. The two did not quite align. "And Mr. Wopshaw," Love added. "He says he balanced them before the meeting." "Afternoon," he said. "Yes, and they were correct then." "So he believes." Love shifted his weight slightly. "You think he's mistaken?" "I think," said Purbright, "that he is consistent." There was a brief silence, filled only by the faint ticking of the station clock, which had none of the self-assurance of the one on Wopshaw's mantel. "Then it must have happened after," Love said, "between his balancing them and reading them out. Or," said Purbright, "between his reading them and believing them to have been balanced." Love frowned, not in disagreement, but in the effort of arranging the thought. Purbright rose and crossed to the window. The street outside had resumed its ordinary pattern, as though the disturbance had been absorbed into it and made part of the design. "A man who is careful," he said, almost to himself, "does not make a mistake of that kind. Not in that way, not with that figure." "And the alteration?" Love asked. Purbright turned slightly. "The alteration is also careful, but it is not the same care." He returned to the desk and picked up the slip of paper once more. The figures stared back at him without explanation. £7, 4 and 6, he said quietly. "It is not what has been taken that interests me." "What then?" "It is what has been left," said Purbright. Love did not immediately respond. He had learned, over time, that such remarks were not invitations to agreement, but to patience. Purbright folded the paper once and placed it in the account book, marking the page with the altered figure. "Come," he said, "I think we shall call on Mr. Wopshaw again." They stepped out together into the afternoon, which had by now settled into a mild and agreeable sameness. Nothing in it suggested urgency. Yet as they walked, the arrangement of things, path, cupboard, book, and bag, had begun, almost imperceptibly, to draw itself into a line, and in that line one small figure stood just slightly apart. Mr. Wapshaw answered the door more quickly than before, as though expectation had replaced uncertainty. His expression carried that same apologetic gravity, but it had acquired a trace of relief at the sight of the inspector, as if the presence of inquiry itself might restore balance. "I have been going over the figures again," he said, stepping aside at once, "several times. I thought perhaps, well, one might see it differently on a fourth attempt." "That is sometimes the case," said Purbright, entering. The sitting-room remained as it had been, orderly, unassuming, with the clock maintaining its steady conviction. The account book lay open on the table, its pages spread as if in quiet defence. "I have not altered anything," Mr. Wapshaw added quickly. "Only looked. I should prefer it that way," said Purbright. He took the chair he had occupied earlier and opened the book to the marked page. The inserted slip fell slightly forward, and he steadied it with a finger before continuing. "You balanced these in the afternoon," he said. "Yes, and you are certain they were correct at that time?" "I am as certain as I can be. I distinctly remember there was a small difficulty with the subscription list, but I resolved it." "Everything agreed?" Purbright nodded. "And after that you left the book?" "Where?" "Here," said Wapshaw, indicating the table. "I went out briefly to post a letter, only 10 minutes, and the house was unattended." Purbright did not look up at once. He turned a page, then another, not searching, but allowing the movement to suggest its own direction. "You returned, and did not examine the accounts again until the meeting. That is so, and during the meeting they were passed round." "Yes, people wished to see them." Purbright closed the book gently. "You have been treasurer for 9 years. Just so, and in that time, have you ever had a discrepancy of this kind?" "Never." There was no pride in the answer, only a quiet statement of habit. Purbright rose and walked slowly to the mantel, where the clock continued its steady work. He regarded it for a moment, then spoke without turning. "You keep your accounts carefully, Mr. Wapshaw?" "I try to. You form your figures in a particular way." Wapshaw hesitated, unsure whether this required agreement. "I suppose one does. For example," Purbright continued, "your falls are closed." There was a small pause. "Yes," said Wapshaw, "they always have been." Purbright turned then and looked at him directly, though without emphasis. "That is what I observed." Wapshaw's eyes moved, almost involuntarily, towards the open page on the table. "I cannot account for the alteration," he said. "If it is one." Purbright returned to the chair and sat down again. "Let us consider that for a moment. The accounts are correct when you balance them. They are left here, unattended for a short time. They are then brought to the meeting, where they are examined by several people. At some point between those events, a figure is altered." "Yes, and the alteration is careful, but not in your hand." Wapshaw swallowed. "Slightly, no." Purbright inclined his head. "Then we are left with 2 possibilities. Either the alteration occurred in your absence, or it occurred in your presence without your knowledge." The distinction seemed to trouble Wapshaw more than the statement itself. "I would not like to think," he began, and then stopped. "No," said Purbright gently, "one does not like to think about many things. That does not prevent them." There was a silence, during which the clock continued to assert its quiet certainty. "Tell me," Purbright said after a moment, "when the accounts were passed round, did anyone take particular interest?" Wapshaw considered this with care. Councillor Roke examined them closely. "He always does. Mrs. Dalrymple, of course. And yes, Mrs. Croot looked over my shoulder at one point. And Mr. Fellows? He glanced at them, but only briefly. He seemed uncomfortable. Purbright nodded slightly. Uncomfortable things are often avoided. He reached for the account book once more, and turned it so that the altered figure faced the light. The open 4 sat there, quiet but distinct, as though it had always belonged. £7, 4 and 6, he said. A small discrepancy. Yes, small enough, Purbright continued, to be created without difficulty, but not so small as to be accidental. In that particular form. Wopshaw said nothing. Purbright closed the book again and rose. I think, he said, that it would be useful to bring the interested parties together. Not formally, simply to consider the matter in one place. Wopshaw looked up, uncertain. You mean a meeting? A conversation, said Purbright. Arranged. There was a faint sound from the clock as if it had marked the moment. Wopshaw nodded slowly. If you think it advisable, I do. Purbright took his hat and moved towards the door. Love followed, pausing only briefly to glance once more at the table, as though expecting the figures to have altered again in their absence. They stepped out into the late afternoon, where the light had softened without losing its clarity. Behind them the clock continued. Ahead, the matter had begun very quietly to gather its participants into a single place. And among them, one small correction waited to be noticed in the right company. The conversation was arranged for the following evening in the parish room, which had been restored with some care to its ordinary appearance. Chairs were set out, not in rows but in a loose semicircle, suggesting discussion without quite committing to it. The trestle table stood at one side, bearing nothing more provocative than a modest plate of biscuits and a teapot whose presence implied reassurance. They gathered without ceremony. Mr. Wopshaw arrived first, carrying the account book as though it required supervision. Mrs. Dalrymple followed, with her spectacles already positioned for scrutiny. Mrs. Croot entered shortly after, placing her handbag down with the same deliberation she applied to cups. Young Fellows came last of the society members, his manner composed but not settled. Councillor Roke arrived precisely on time. Purbright did not take a central position, nor did he stand. He chose instead a chair slightly to one side, from which he might observe without appearing to do so. Sergeant Love remained near the door, not as a guard, but as a quiet presence that suggested order. For a moment nothing was said. The room held its breath in the mild, expectant way of places accustomed to small events acquiring significance. "I am obliged to you all for coming," Purbright began. "The matter before us is not in itself a large one, but it appears to have gathered a certain degree of attention, and I thought it best that we consider it together." There were small nods, each acknowledging the necessity without claiming it. "The discrepancy," he continued, "is £7, 4 shillings and 6pence. It was not present when the accounts were balanced, but was observed when they were read aloud. Between those 2 points something occurred. Mrs. Dalrymple adjusted her spectacles. An alteration, Inspector." "Yes," said Purbright. "That is one way of describing it." He did not look at the account book as he spoke, but his hand rested lightly upon it, as though it might confirm his words if required. "It has been suggested," he went on, "that the sum may have been taken, that it may have been miscounted, that it may have been altered deliberately. Each of these explanations has its attractions. They are not equally likely," said Councillor Roke, with a firmness that carried the weight of prior consideration. "No," said Purbright, "they are not." He turned slightly towards Mr. Wopshaw. "You balanced the accounts in the afternoon. You are confident they were correct?" "I am," said Wopshaw quietly. "And you left them here, unattended, for a short time?" "Yes." Purbright inclined his head, then shifted his attention without emphasis. During the meeting, the accounts were examined. By several of you, Councillor Roke, you took a particular interest. Roke gave a small, controlled gesture. I considered it my duty. Of course, Mrs. Dalrymple, you compared figures. I did, Mrs. Croot, you observed from a distance. I observe many things, she said. And Mr. Fellows, you glanced at them briefly. Fellows nodded, only briefly. Purbright allowed a moment to pass, not for effect, but for arrangement. The alteration in question is small, he said. A figure changed, a 4, written open rather than closed. The ink is slightly lighter, the hand is careful but not consistent with that of the treasurer. Mrs. Dalrymple inclined her head, satisfied. It is in itself a minor detail, but it is the only detail that does not agree with the rest. He opened the account book then and turned it so that the page faced them. The figures lay there without protest, their order disturbed only by the one that was not quite as it should be. You will observe, he said, that the alteration does not create the discrepancy in its entirety. It adjusts it. There was a faint shifting among the chairs, as though the thought required physical accommodation. In other words, Purbright continued, the sum does not arise solely from that change. It has been arranged. Arranged, said Roke. Yes, placed in such a way as to appear to belong. He closed the book again gently. It is not, therefore, simply a matter of someone taking money, nor of someone making a mistake. It is a matter of someone deciding how that mistake should appear. The room was very quiet now, and that, he said, is not the action of a careless person, nor of an impulsive one. It is the action of someone who believes themselves capable of managing appearances. There was no movement, but the stillness had altered. It had become attentive. Purbright rose then, not abruptly, but with the natural conclusion of a thought. I do not propose to draw conclusions at this moment, he said, only to suggest that we consider not who had the money, but who had the opportunity to adjust how it would be understood. His gaze moved, not settling, but passing lightly from one face to another, because in a matter of this kind, he added, it is not always the missing sum that reveals the truth. He paused as though allowing the room to settle around that. It is the manner in which it has been made to fit. The teapot gave a small, almost inaudible sound as it cooled. No one reached for it. No one spoke immediately after Purbright's last remark. The silence did not resist him. It adjusted itself as though making room for what might follow. In that space, attention shifted not openly, but with a series of small, almost imperceptible recalibrations. A glance held a fraction longer. A posture altered by degrees. Councillor Roke was the first to move, though only slightly. He adjusted the position of his chair, aligning it more squarely with the table. If you are suggesting, he said, with careful neutrality, that the discrepancy was arranged rather than accidental, then it follows that someone here. Yes, said Purbright, not interrupting but completing. It follows that someone present, or with access equivalent to presence, made a deliberate adjustment. Roke inclined his head, accepting the phrasing without conceding its implications. Then we are not dealing with uncertainty, he continued, we are dealing with intention. Of a particular kind, said Purbright, not to remove money without notice, but to remove it in such a way that the notice would fall elsewhere. The words settled quietly, but not without effect. Young Fellows shifted in his chair, the movement of a man who feels himself being approached from a direction he cannot quite identify. I don't see how that applies to me, he said. I handed the money over exactly as I received it. I have no reason to think otherwise, said Purbright. Fellows blinked, as if the absence of accusation required more effort than its presence. Mrs. Dalrymple leaned forward slightly. Then the alteration must have been made here. At the meeting, there was no other opportunity. On the contrary, said Purbright, there were several. But not all of them were equally useful. Mrs. Croot gave a small, satisfied sound, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. You see, Purbright continued, the difficulty is not merely to alter a figure. It is to do so in a manner that will suggest a particular conclusion. A casual alteration might produce confusion. A careful one produces direction. And what direction is that? Said Roke. Towards the person most easily associated with the money, said Purbright. The one who handled it last, and in a visible way. Fellows looked up quickly. That's absurd. It is convenient, said Purbright gently. The young man's mouth closed again, though not entirely from agreement. Purbright moved a step closer to the table and opened the account book once more. He did not draw attention to the altered figure this time, but allowed it to remain where it was, part of the arrangement rather than its focus. Let us consider the sequence, he said. The money is collected at the Rose Show. It is counted, observed, and delivered. The accounts are balanced and found correct. They are then left unattended briefly in a room to which several people have access. Later, they are brought to a meeting where they are examined by interested parties. He paused, not for effect, but to allow the order to settle. At some point within that sequence, the figure is altered, not to create the discrepancy entirely, but to shape it. Mrs. Dalrymple nodded, her attention fixed upon the page. And the alteration, Purbright continued, is not the work of someone unfamiliar with accounts. It is made with an understanding of how such figures are read and by whom. There was a slight movement from Councillor Roke, almost too small to be named. You are suggesting, he said, that the person responsible possessed both access and what experience? I am suggesting, said Purbright, that they possessed familiarity. With the accounts, with the habits of those who keep them, said Purbright. The distinction was not lost, though it was not immediately spoken. Mrs. Croot shifted her handbag slightly, as though its position had become relevant. And the key, she said, the cupboard? The key, said Purbright, is an arrangement of convenience. It allows access, but does not dictate its use. The alteration in the book does not require the cupboard, it requires the book itself. Mrs. Dalrymple's eyes moved again to the page, tracing the line of figures with renewed attention. Then it was done during the meeting, she said, while the accounts were being passed. Possibly, said Purbright, or shortly before. In either case, the opportunity must coincide with a reason to direct attention elsewhere. There was a pause, and in it a subtle realignment of understanding. Councillor Roke spoke again, more slowly now. You imply that the person responsible intended suspicion to fall on Mr. Fellows. I imply, said Purbright, that the arrangement of the discrepancy makes that suspicion convenient. Fellows looked from one to the other, his expression caught between relief and unease. But why? He said. Why would anyone do that? Purbright closed the book once more, his hand resting upon it lightly. That, he said, is the question that remains. He straightened, his gaze moving again, not fixing but including, because in a matter of this kind the act itself is seldom sufficient. It is accompanied by a purpose. The room remained still but no longer neutral. And the purpose, Purbright added quietly, is rarely as small as the sum involved. The stillness that followed did not break. It altered, as though each person present had begun to consider not only what had been said, but where it might settle. The figures, the book, the small corrections were no longer abstract. They had acquired direction. Purbright allowed the silence to remain until it had done its work. We have considered, he said at last, the opportunity and the method. It may now be useful to consider the purpose. Mrs. Dalrymple inclined her head slightly, as though this was the natural next step. Councillor Roke remained composed, though his fingers, resting on the arm of the chair, had ceased their earlier stillness. "You suggest," Roke said, "that the purpose extends beyond the sum itself." "I suggest," said Purbright, "that the sum has been used." "Used?" "As a means," said Purbright, "rather than an end." There was a faint movement from Mrs. Croot, not quite a nod, but something adjacent to agreement. "In a society such as this," Purbright continued, "money does not exist in isolation. It is connected to responsibility, to trust, to the appearance of order." "Yes," said Mrs. Dalrymple, "naturally. And when that order is disturbed," he said, "attention is directed towards those most visibly connected with the disturbance." Fellows shifted again, though less sharply than before. The idea had begun, reluctantly, to detach itself from him. Purbright's gaze moved briefly towards him, then on. "The treasurer is responsible for the accounts. The collector is associated with the money, but neither of these roles necessarily determines where suspicion will settle. That depends upon how the discrepancy presents itself." He placed a hand lightly on the account book once more. "In this case, the presentation is not random. The alteration directs attention towards the point at which the money was last handled openly." Fellows let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "And away from," said Roke, with careful precision, "any other point." "Yes," said Purbright. There was a pause, during which the implication arranged itself without assistance. Mrs. Dalrymple spoke, more slowly now. Then the person responsible wished to avoid attention. More than that, said, "At Purbright, they wished to redirect it." "To what end?" said Mrs. Croot. Purbright did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly, as though considering not the question, but its placement. "Councillor Roke," he said after a moment, "you have taken an interest in the accounts over some time." Roke inclined his head. "A general interest, as I have said. And you have, on occasion, examined them." "Yes." "With familiarity." Roke's expression did not change, but something in it became more deliberate. "If you are suggesting I am observing," said Purbright gently, "that familiarity allows for certain adjustments to be made without attracting notice, particularly if those adjustments are made with an understanding of how the figures are formed." Mrs. Dalrymple's eyes moved almost involuntarily towards the open 4. "You mean," she said, "that the alteration required knowledge of how Mr. Wopshaw writes his figures?" "Yes." "And that knowledge," she began, then stopped, "would not available to everyone," said Purbright. The room did not move, but its attention had narrowed. Roke leaned forward slightly. "Inspector, I cannot see that this line of reasoning—" "No," said Purbright. "Nor could one, without considering one further detail." He reached into the account book and withdrew the folded slip of paper. He did not open it immediately, but held it between his fingers as though it were simply part of the arrangement. "When a figure is altered," he said, "it is done to produce a particular result. In this case, the result is not exact, it is approximate. The discrepancy is not a clean sum, but an irregular one, £7, 4 shillings and 6pence. He opened the paper and placed it beside the book. "This suggests," he continued, "that the alteration was not made to conceal a precise amount taken, but to create a discrepancy that would appear plausible without inviting immediate correction." Roke's gaze moved briefly to the paper, then away. "And that," Purbright said quietly, "is not the action of someone improvising. It is the action of someone adjusting what is already known." There was a stillness now that had weight. Mrs. Croot shifted her chair slightly, the movement sounding louder than it was. "You mean," she said, that the person already knew what the correct figures were? Yes. And altered them afterwards? Yes. Roke straightened, his expression controlled, but no longer entirely at ease. Inspector, I must protest this is speculation. No, said Purbright, it is an arrangement. He looked at him directly now, though without emphasis. And it leads, he said, to a very simple question. The room seemed to draw in slightly as though preparing for it. Who, Purbright said, had both the opportunity to examine the accounts when they were correct, and the familiarity to alter them in a way that would pass unnoticed while directing attention elsewhere? No one spoke. The question did not require an answer yet. It had only to be placed. The question remained where it had been placed, neither answered nor withdrawn, and in that stillness its effect became quietly unavoidable. No one looked directly at Councillor Roke at first, which in Flaxborough amounted to doing so with considerable emphasis. Roke himself did not immediately respond. He sat upright, his hands resting evenly upon the arms of the chair, his expression composed to the point of intention. This is a serious implication, Inspector, he said at last. Yes, said Purbright, it is. And you base it upon what? A difference in the way a figure is formed? A general familiarity? I base it, said Purbright, upon the arrangement of several small consistencies. He moved the account book slightly, not to display it, but to restore its place. You examined the accounts during the meeting, he continued. You have done so on previous occasions. You are accustomed to figures and to the manner in which they are kept. Roke said nothing. You were present at the Rose Show, Purbright went on. You observed the collection of the gate money. You remained after others had begun to leave. I had responsibilities, Roke said. Of course, said Purbright, and you have expressed more than once a concern regarding the management of the Society's affairs. A legitimate concern, yes. There was a pause, not for hesitation, but for completion. In such circumstances, Purbright continued, it would not be unreasonable to wish to demonstrate that concern, to show that the current arrangements are insufficient. Roke's gaze remained steady, but the stillness in it had altered. You are suggesting, he said, that I manufactured this discrepancy. I am suggesting, said Purbright, that you adjusted the accounts in a manner that would produce one. There was a faint intake of breath from Mrs. Croot, quickly contained. And the money, Roke said. The money, said Purbright, was not the primary object. Roke's expression tightened slightly. Then what was it? The appearance of disorder, said Purbright, placed where it would be seen and attributed where it would be believed. Fellows looked up sharply, the last of the unease leaving him in a sudden, quiet shift. Mrs. Dalrymple's spectacles caught the light as she leaned forward, her attention now fixed entirely. You mean, she said, that the sum was arranged, not taken? Partially taken, said Purbright, but not in the manner assumed. A small amount removed to give substance to the alteration, enough to support the appearance, but not enough to require precision. Roke's hand moved slightly on the arm of the chair, then was still again. This is conjecture, he said. No, said Purbright, it is proportionate. He took the folded slip of paper and placed it beside the book once more. A man who intends to conceal theft removes a sum cleanly. A man who intends to demonstrate disorder adjusts it. The figure you created is not exact, it is plausible, Roke did not reply, and the alteration, and, Purbright added, is not yours in habit, but in understanding. You did not form the figure as Mr. Wopshaw would. You formed it as it needed to appear. The room was very quiet. For what purpose? Mrs. Croot said softly. Purbright answered without emphasis. To justify intervention, he said, to establish that the Society requires stricter oversight, that its accounts are not secure in their present form. Mrs. Dalrymple's lips pressed together, not in disagreement, but in recognition. And to do so, Purbright continued, without appearing to act directly. The discrepancy would speak for itself. The suspicion would fall elsewhere. The conclusion would follow. Roke's composure held for a moment longer, then altered not in collapse but in adjustment, as though a position long maintained had been set down. "I took nothing of consequence," he said. "No," said Purbright, "only what was necessary." Roke exhaled slowly. "Society is inefficient, you must see that. Careless, informal. It required correction." "Perhaps," said Purbright, "but not of that kind." There was no further argument. After a moment Roke rose, not abruptly, but with the same measured control he had shown throughout. He did not look at the others. "I shall, of course, make restitution," he said. "That will not be necessary," said Purbright. "The sum can be restored without difficulty. The matter need not extend beyond this room." Roke inclined his head once, acknowledging the arrangement, and stepped back. The tension did not vanish. It settled like dust after movement. Mrs. Croot adjusted her handbag. Mrs. Dalrymple closed the account book with quiet finality. Fellows sat back, as though released from a position he had not chosen. Purbright remained where he was for a moment longer, his gaze resting briefly on the figures that had caused so much arrangement. £7, 4 and 6, he said quietly. A small error. No one disagreed. Outside, the evening had resumed its ordinary course. The parish room having held its disturbance,